Today's episode is proudly sponsored by the Rising Tide Mastermind. The Rising Tide Mastermind is one of my favorite things that I look forward to each and every week because I get to see people that have my best interest in mind. I know this because I have their best interest in mind. And when you get people together in a room like that, you can just imagine how people want to help other people. If this sounds like something you want to learn more about, go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. I'm Trace Blackmore. I am the host of this awesome industrial water treatment podcast. And I find it interesting. We are an industrial water treatment podcast, but I look at who is listening to our podcast, and we have so many more people than just industrial water treaters. And I'll ask somebody that says that they're not in the industry, but they listen to the podcast. Why do they do that? And they say it's all the topics that we talk about. Some people actually say they like my voice, if you can imagine that. So I don't know what the reason is that you listen to this podcast, but I want to say thank you for that. I also have to say that 7+ years ago, I had no idea what a passion this podcast was going to become for me. I had no idea of all the new people I was going to be able to meet because of this podcast. And I had hoped this next one, but I had no idea how much it would actually affect it. I had hoped that if 3 people listen to this podcast, that I would have 3 people that I would hopefully speak into, let them know how valuable what they do each and every day is, and inspire them to be the best at it that they could be. Well, I'm happy to say we have a few more than 3 listeners to this podcast. And when I go to an industry event and people come up to me and they'll say, I got this certification because of you, or I did this because of you. First off, it is not because of me. Maybe I nudged you just a little bit. Maybe I gave you some facts that you didn't consider why you should get that credential. But I want to go on record that you did all that work. All that heavy lifting was lifted by you. I'm glad I can be a motivator to that. And that's really what I set out to do when I started this podcast. I had no idea that it was going to be so successful and mean so much to so many people. And we, of course, call everybody that listens to this podcast the Scaling Up Nation. And it's just amazing to see how the Scaling Up Nation has grown. Well, Nation, yesterday, if you were in the United States, we celebrated Independence Day. That's July 4th. Of course, today is July 5th, if you're listening to this episode as soon as it came out. I heard in England, they do not call the Independence Day over there. Why would they? I actually heard some interesting things they called Independence Day over there, but some of those actually weren't proper to say on a family-rated podcast, but it was all in good fun. So, as we all know, back in 1776, July 4th, 13 American colonies gathered together and they signed the Declaration of Independence, which, of course, eventually created our country. And a great day, a great experience. We had no idea. I say we, I wasn't there, but they had no idea. Could they create a better system than what they were enduring? And for being a citizen of the United States of America, I would say, oh my gosh, what an amazing country that they created, with all sorts of freedoms, with all sorts of liberties, with all sorts of opportunities. And I've heard it called the greatest experiment, the United States of America. But there were so many people back then that believed with all their hearts and with their lives that we needed to be independent, that we needed to start our own country. And one of those individuals is Patrick Henry. And I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. That's my hometown. Now, Patrick Henry was the first governor of Virginia. And I will say, back when I was in grade school, we studied a lot about our local history. I remember we had workbooks that was just about our local history. We had one that was just about our county. And I just learned so much about that. I'm disappointed that my son doesn't have that same opportunity with the school that he went to here in Georgia. I guess that's just not something they do anymore. But I learned so much. And amongst what I learned was a respect for our founding fathers. And as you know, many of them came from Virginia, my home state. And one of them was Patrick Henry. And you probably know Patrick Henry and his famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." You probably have not heard his speech in the entirety. And I've read it before. And I'm also going to give you a link if you go to the show notes page where I wish I could play it on this show, but I don't have permission to do that. So I'm just going to send you directly to it. It's Mike Rowe's show. And Mike Rowe, I've always been a fan of him. And he does a podcast called The Way I Heard It. He also is the host of Dirty Jobs. And he is where I got the model for this podcast, where you need to ask the audience for what the next episode is going to be so we can stay on the air. Well, anyway, Mike Rowe has an incredible voice, and he reads Patrick Henry's "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death" speech, and it is phenomenal. And I'm willing to bet that most people out there have never heard that speech in the entirety, and I think it should be a July 4th tradition that you read or you listen to that. And I'm going to make it really easy. I'm going to put that on the show notes page so you can very easily link to Mike Rowe's podcast, which is called The Way That I Heard It. And this was his episode 162. And if you're keeping score, Mike used to do a very consolidated podcast. It was like 5, 10, 15 minutes tops. And it was really quick. And then a couple of years back, he started doing a longer podcast. And sometimes these podcasts are maybe 3 hours long. Again, I just love listening to Mike, and Mike does a great job with his podcast. So maybe I'll make you a fan of this podcast. Make sure you listen to Scaling Up H2O first, and then you can go listen to The Way That I Heard It. But I guarantee you are going to love how he reads Patrick Henry's speech. Something else we're getting ready to celebrate is we are having our next hang. The hang is where we get together, members of the Scaling Up Nation. We get to meet each other and we get to network with each other. You're going to meet people in this industry that you haven't met before. And you might even find somebody that can answer that issue that you have about that piece of equipment that you've tried everything and it just will not work. Happens all the time on each and every hang. And the hang you can sign up for by going to scalinguph2o.com/hang. And you want to mark your calendars for July 11th at 6 p.m. Eastern. So just next week, hey, we can talk about your thoughts on the Patrick Henry speech that Mike Rowe read. Again, that is one of my favorite readings of that. He does a great job. It is my hope that we can talk about that and so much more on the hang. Once again, that is scalinguph2o.com/hang. Nation, each and every August, we do Legionella Awareness Month. We started that back during the pandemic when all the conferences were canceled, and so many people had questions about Legionella bacteria. So we did that once. It was some of our highest rated episodes, and we figured, you know what? People seem to enjoy it. Let's do it again. And they were rated even higher. Well, the next year, I have to say, I really thought, do we need to do this again? We've already done this for a month. Is anybody going to listen to it? And again, the ratings were even higher. So we've been doing this. This is our fourth year now, I believe, that we are doing it. And we've got some great guests lined up. We've got some great information. And this is a topic that if you're in this industry, you just need to know about. And it seems like the Scaling Up Nation really enjoys learning more and more about pathogens, especially Legionella. So we're going to bring that to you again this coming August. So anyway, I know you are going to enjoy that. And thank you for so many that have written in and let me know what you want me to talk about this Legionella Awareness Month. Now, if you're wondering how those people got their information out of their heads and to me and my wonderful staff, well, that's an easy one to answer. They went to scalinguph2o.com over to our show ideas page, and they just wrote out exactly what it was they were thinking. Now, you might remember on occasion, we will play people on the air asking me a question, and you can do that. There's a little microphone button there, and you can record your question. So a lot of times I'll play those on the air, and then I'll either have a guest or I will answer those questions myself. So by all means, feel free to do that for Legionella Awareness Month or any topic that you want to hear us talk about. Speaking of things to celebrate, mark your calendars because October 7th through 11th is our next Industrial Water Week celebration. And of course, we're going to bring a brand new episode to you, not every week, but every single day during that week. And we have been planning this year, the entire year. We've gotten a little smarter this year, and we've started planning earlier to make sure that we always bring you the best as you have come to expect with this podcast. So this year is going to be no different, although I have to say I think we've upped our game quite a bit. So please mark your calendars starting on October 2nd all the way to October 11th, where we're going to be celebrating Pre-Treatment Monday, Boiler Tuesday, Cooling Wednesday, Wastewater Thursday, and Careers Friday. And be sure when you're doing that to hashtag scaling up H2O. I love to see all the things that people do within Industrial Water Week. One of my favorite things is on Friday, so many companies get a cake and then they'll take a picture of that and they'll post. We had, I think, 60 or so cakes last year. That was just awesome. So Nation, thank you for playing along with me. I really enjoy it when I see how we are all celebrating together. And of course, we also talk about events that you can attend. And this is a fun one. This is Water Jam 2024. It takes place in Virginia Beach, Virginia. We're talking a lot about Virginia today. And that is September 9th through 12th. And this is a very interactive convention with the American Waterworks Association. So over 250 exhibitors are in the exhibit hall, but there's so many hands-on demonstrators that are there, and then they have trailers showcasing the latest in water and wastewater technologies, all sorts of hand-on equipment. So it's just a really fun conference to attend. And if you want more information about that, of course, you can go to scalinguph2o.com, go over to our events section, and it won't just have that information. It will have everything that we know about so you can create your calendar to see where you want to go. And this next one, I'm going to be there. I hope you are going to be there. This is taking place September 10th through 13th. It's the Association of Water Technologies 2024 Annual Convention and Expo. It's taking place in Louisville, Kentucky. What a great city. Can't wait to go there. And the AWT convention is one of those conventions that I've been going to since 2003, and it has gotten better each and every convention. Of course, I served on the board of that association. I was president of that association. I still serve on the education committee, and I cannot say enough good things about the Association of Water Technologies. And if you've never been to a conference, folks, let me tell you, this is a place that you can go and meet pretty much every single one of your vendors and potential vendors within the water treatment industry if you practice the same type of industrial water treatment that I practice. It is all under one roof. And it is all full of people that know what you do. It is amazing to just start a conversation with somebody and they get the context. You don't have to explain what it is that you do. You can just say, hey, this is what's going on, and they get it. It was actually that reason that I started the Rising Tide Mastermind, so we could process issues together without having all that external context. We know what we're going through. We can just get right to the issue. Well, the AWT convention is full of not only Rising Tide Mastermind members, but everybody in that industry. So it's my hope that you go over to scalinguph2o.com/events, look at the AWT 2024 annual convention, and see if you can find a way to go there. I would sure love to see you there. And if you're there, make sure you make a point to come find me. I'd love to talk to you. I'd love to find out what you think about this show and if you have any ideas for me. Well, Nation, I'm always looking for ideas for this podcast, and we're going to go a little bit different route today, and we're not going to talk about industrial water treatment. My guest today is an expert in broadcasting. Yes, that's right. I said broadcasting. And we're talking about July 4th. We're talking about how the United States was founded. Well, we also run the United States in a particular way based on how our founding fathers set it up. And we have a fairly big election coming up. And I know what you're thinking. Oh my gosh, Trace, not you too. You're starting to get political on us. No, I promise I am not. And you will know why I am not when I introduce my next guest, who is a friend and a mentor of mine. And I kind of use his model of how I approach any topic that I talk about on this podcast. And we're going to talk about news and how do we get our news and all of the things that you should know when you are devouring all the information out there about all the different parties, about all the different candidates, because you have a decision to make in a couple of months. Now, if you're listening outside of the United States, I promise this is still a great episode for you as well, because you are going to hear from one of the top journalists of our time, and you have the same issues that are going on in your country as we do in the United States of America. So, Scaling Up Nation, I am really excited to bring this interview to you, and here it is. My lab partner today is Scott Slade, a local hero here in Atlanta and broadcaster for over 50 years. Scott, so excited to have you on the Scaling Up H2O podcast.
Trace, it's great to be back with you again. Nothing else, visit with a good friend.
Yeah, you and I met scuba diving. I was your scuba dive instructor. How fortunate was that for me?
Yeah, I got to get back in the pool again. I'll be honest with you. I finally got the card thanks to your guidance, and then COVID hit. So it's more in our rearview mirror now. So, we need to get together and run through all the hand signals and everything so I know I'm safe. But you're a great teacher.
I cannot wait to do that. So you let me know when you want to do it, and I will meet you at the pool, and we'll go through all of that. We need to do a trip together.
Yeah, we do. We sure do. You're good company, man.
Well, Scott, you mentioned COVID, and of course, we're now developing what post-COVID life is like, but you did me a great honor on episode 158, and that's when we were at the Association of Water Technology's virtual conference, and I'm glad we're back to in-person conferences, but I accepted the most prestigious award in industrial water treatment, the Raybaum Memorial Water Treater of the Year Award. And I was a little bummed out that I didn't get to do that in person. And you really helped me out and made me feel a lot better. You did the introduction to episode 158. And I want to thank you for that.
Oh, gosh, that was a great honor. You kidding? I mean, it's not every day you win a national award. And I know you know what you're doing in your business. So, gosh, it was my pleasure to be able to do that with you and for you. Welcome to every water treater's favorite podcast, Scaling Up H2O, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. Coming to you live from the Association of Water Technology's virtual convention. Well, as live as we can be at a virtual convention. This is Scott Slade of Atlanta's Morning News. It is my pleasure to introduce the host of this podcast and this year's recipient of the Association of Water Technology's Ray Baum Memorial Water Technologist of the Year Award, Trace Blackmore.
Well, there it was. And again, Scott, thank you again for doing that. Such a great honor. And that made me feel a lot better about being virtual.
Well, that's good. It counted either way, right? So that's the good news.
Scott, I mentioned in the introduction that you have been in broadcasting for over 50 years. I want to know your story. How did you get started in broadcasting?
Well, that is kind of a fun story. I would say it was in one of my hometown radio stations in Griffin, Georgia. And that was a great media-rich little market just south of Atlanta because we could hear the Atlanta stations, And we had 3 radio stations there that were terrific in their own right. And I did wind up working at all 3 of them while I was in high school, but that's not where it started. It actually began in the top of a chicken coop on our farm. And my dad let me put together my own little audio studio up there. And it was so hot during the summer. I just had, passed along turntables and an amplifier and a speaker and that kind of stuff from my dad's audio stuff that he didn't need anymore. I couldn't leave my records up there. Well, not records like, keeping track of finances, but vinyl records because they would melt. It was so hot. But that's where I learned how to spin discs and talk and whatnot. I just did my own little radio shows for no one in particular but myself. And gosh, I guess I learned an awful lot on how to keep the meters bouncing and keep the show on the road in that chicken coop. So when I walked into my local radio station, when I was 15 years old, I'd just gotten my 3rd class radio telephone license with broadcast endorsement, which is what you had to have back in those days. That was January 1970, by the way. So it's been a while. When I walked in, I had a pretty good feel of what might be expected, even though I didn't have an audition tape or anything else to pass along. And they just kind of looked at me and laughed at me, said, well, what can you do to show us that you know what you're doing? And I said, well, have you got any place that I can record an audition tape? And they said, oh, yeah, there's a little studio right down the hall there. Go on there and make us a tape and play DJ for a little bit. I'd never seen that studio in my life. So I didn't really know what to expect, but I went in, I did what I could, brought the tape back out. They listened to it. And Trace, I guess they were so desperate for someone to go on the air on Sunday afternoons, they hired me.
Scott, are you kidding? They heard your voice and they said, we've got to sign this guy. You've got the best voice in broadcasting.
I don't know about that. I was 15 years old, but they paid me $1.50 an hour. And I think I worked from noon until sign off. And that was one of those daytime radio stations that had to go off the air at sunset. It was a country station. And they said, yeah, you look fairly dependable. Here's a key to the station. And and what you're going to need for Sunday, here's the package for you. It's a money bag, a receipt book, and a gun. I said, what is the gun for? And they said, hey, you're taking cash, baby. These groups come in on Sunday afternoon, and there'll be 3 or 4 of them, and they pay $16 for 15 minutes. And you've got to take the cash and write them a receipt and get them on the air and get them off the air. It was live radio. I mean, it was like, it was gospel groups and a couple of church groups and whatnot. And do I really need a gun? So that was my introduction to doing a lot of different things at one time.
And then ultimately, you made it to Atlanta Morning News on WSB Radio, where you were the host for over 32 years.
All right. My journey at WSB actually started in 1984. I just moved back from Cincinnati, and that was sort of a side trip in my career. I've been a DJ and a program manager and whatnot with a terrific company in Jacksonville and Charlotte. And at the age of 29, I just kind of burned out. I just said, you know what? I just need to do something different. So a fellow I'd worked with had started a satellite earth station company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he wanted me to come up and open up a retail division for him, which, again, it was sort of like that production room I'd never seen before. I'd never done that, but he liked my management style, so I gave it a whirl. And Trace, I just found out it wasn't for me. and I missed radio terribly. But here was the good part about those 6 months in Cincinnati. I was able to listen to a fellow named Jim Scott on WLW Radio up there, a Hall of Famer. And I'd never heard anything quite like him. And he was the perfect mentor in absentia for doing an information-based morning radio show. He introduced all the other elements, whatnot, went to the traffic and the weather, and he was the host on what wound up being a show very much like Atlanta's Morning News when we started it in 1991. So there's a real example of not letting any opportunity, even though it didn't work out very well there, go to waste. But in 1984, they hired me on as the traffic reporter, the helicopter traffic reporter for WSB. They needed somebody. And I showed them that I wasn't afraid to fly and I could keep up where the traffic was. Then that went very well. I had a great time doing that. 7 years later, they decided they wanted to make a change in the philosophy of the morning show and go all information. And they said, yeah, Scott, we want you to take that over. Would you like to hear a story about how that happened?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I was called into the office after traffic one morning, and they said, we've decided to make a change in the morning show, and we're going to drop the music format, and we want you to do it. Our research shows us that our listeners consider you to be trustworthy, warm, intelligent, and you're not funny, which will make you perfect for the job we have in mind for you. And I said, you realize I'm giving up the most secure job in Atlanta media, the traffic reporter here in the town where traffic tends to lead the news every morning. And I said, yeah, we know. I said, what if this experiment doesn't work out? And he says, don't worry about it. We'll take care of you. And gosh, that's just the way they do business. At Cox Enterprises at the time owned the station. Cox Media Group does now. But I said, okay, let's go for it. So I believe it was January 26, 1991, Atlanta's Morning News went on the air. The ground invasion had just begun in the Gulf War, and we had snow on the ground in Atlanta. So it was a good news day.
Snow in Atlanta, for anybody that's not from Atlanta, that is all you're talking about for probably a week.
Yep. Yep. Before, during, and after. Everybody's going to have a story.
Scott, I moved to Atlanta in 2000, and I have been listening to you ever since we moved here. You were part of my morning routine, and it's great that you've gone on to chapter 2, but I've got to tell you, I sure miss you as part of my mornings every single morning. I love it when you guest host now.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a lot of fun to work that muscle. And it's invigorating to be around the people that I quite honestly admire and adore. I mean, those folks there at inside WSB, around 12 people touch that morning show every day. And, I miss them all. So to be able to go back every now and then and give the new host, Chris Chandler, a chance to have a little time off. I mean, that's an amazing thing to be able to do. And Chris, by the way, is just doing a great job with that show. I mean, he has all kinds of chops from his network days and where he grew up. And he's also a professional musician.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He is. He's a keyboardist, piano player. And so he knows something about timing. And you can really tell the way he executes the show.
Scott, you invited me to your studio a couple of years ago. I think it was pre-COVID. I'm pretty sure it was. And it was amazing to watch you work. So, Nation, if you can imagine, there are a couple monitors, there are a couple of microphones there, and Scott is trying to find news stories, but he researches everything before he talks about it. And he's got 50 things going. And of course, he's got to balance the traffic guy that's coming in, the weather report, and he's got 50 things juggling. And then he'll turn to me and he'll have a conversation. And then he'll go right back and he'll start doing it again. It was amazing how you juggled all of those balls. I could not imagine how stressed I would have been.
Well, it's a little bit like being a jazz musician, really. When you get right down to it, you're all playing the same song and you're all looking at the same rundown. So there are a few surprises because it's live, but I don't see anyone else. I'm in a studio and the anchors are in another room. Obviously, the traffic people are out either in the traffic center or in the sky, and the meteorologist is in the newsroom and the reporter's in the field and that sort of thing. So, it is a little bit like a jazz tune, but we're still playing, 8-bar blues, I guess you would say, all the way through. So it's just something that you practice and you get the feel for it and you trust each other. That's a really, really big thing. You trust each other to know that no one's going to actually leave you hanging, and people won't.
Well, Scott, we might have some members of the Scaling Up Nation that are wondering what we're talking about here today. We're not going to be talking about water treatment, although you did have me on a segment that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Scaling Up Nation, Scott has been a great mentor to me since we met. He asked if there was anything that he could do for me. I told him about this podcast, and he helped me figure out that I could really up my game if I increased my equipment and knew how to use it. And Scott was instrumental in doing both of those things. So thank you, Scott. You really improved our sound, our quality, and gave me a lot of tips in making sure that I was interviewing properly and scheduling all those things. So I can't thank you enough for that. But the reason you're on today is in all the years that I've been listening to you on Atlanta's Morning News, you have covered such a vast variety of different topics, specifically around political events, elections, things like that. And I have never once heard you tell anybody what they should think, what party they should vote for. And in fact, I think all of Atlanta has no idea how you vote in November because you are so non-biased. And that's what I want to talk about today. We are getting ready to get so much information overload. As a matter of fact, it's already here. And vote for this guy, don't vote for that guy, all mudslinging, all of this stuff. But then now we have the part that media plays in that role. Now, when you and I had lunch recently, you said that this was a topic that you were very passionate about because media does play such an important role when it comes to our elections. So I wanted to start out with asking, why is that such an important topic for you?
Well, first of all, the media, journalism is the first draft of history, right? I love that quote. And there is really nothing more important than accuracy when it comes to, for lack of a better way to put it, traditional media. Yeah, there are people in media who make a living and they let you know that they have a point of view, they have a bias, they have a way of thinking that they want you to buy into, and that's fine. If you know that up front. But in my world, and by the way, that was a huge compliment you paid me just a moment ago saying you can't tell really what my political philosophy is. Again, my philosophy is to get it right. It's your job to tell a balanced story. And not every story has a second or third side per se, like an official announcement or breaking news. But when they do have more than one view, more than one angle, it's important to at least mention it to let folks know that there's more to it. And with any luck, it's a chance to cut through to what really matters to your listeners.
Yeah, and I want to underscore today's show is not about political candidates. It's really about how we get our news and what we need to know from a professional that's been in the industry for well over 50 years. So let's start there. Why is it so important to consider where and who you're getting your news from?
Oh, that is a great question. There are standard sources, for instance, first-person sources like the candidates themselves. If the candidate's saying it, he or she's not being misquoted, right? I mean, you're letting them say it themselves. Or their opponents. But you can't be everywhere, and there's only 60 minutes in an hour. So especially local media outlets that I think are as important or maybe more important than the national outlets, we do depend on venerable other outlets to help us do some of that homework, like the Associated Press, our network connections to CBS, CNN, our sister stations, TV station, WSB TV, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Nothing beats the kind of legitimacy that comes from a well-staffed local newspaper. They have the personnel and the time to dig out the details that go deep on stories that really matter. Now, these folks have a lot of resources to vet their stories and get to the kernels of truth. And the same advice I give people when they ask this question, don't depend on one source for your news. No, we don't. Read a strong daily newspaper or two every day, even if it's online. Listen to more than one radio and TV station. Listen to more than one pundit. Don't get caught in the echo chamber of ideas. By that means just telling you what you want to hear. Sometimes people need to tell you what you need to hear. And you want to talk about sound bites and how dangerous they can be?
Sound bites are, I think, because people are so busy, they want a compressed amount of news, and they use sound bites. And you mentioned people using the candidates. They will take sound bites, and a lot of times just parts of sound bites so they can prove one point or another. So, yes, I would love to talk about sound bites.
It is easy to take something out of context when there's a sensational soundbite. And you should try to understand the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how of where that sound came from and why it's being used in the story. Now, if nothing else, the reason you use a soundbite is to prove that you've actually got the source saying what to you is the kernel of truth in the story. Then it's up to you as a journalist to dig further and let folks know, again, why you used it. It's up to the journalist to make sure you understand the context. And again, Trace, most of the time it's just a function of time. I mean, you don't have an hour to play back the whole State of the Union message, but was there a key moment in that State of the Union message that's still resonating the next day? Well, that's fair game, even if it's 5 or 6 seconds. I guess most radio broadcast stories, at least in commercial media, around 40 seconds or so, the whole story. TV news stories, maybe 90 seconds to 2.5 minutes. You have to be able to tell the story somehow. And it's a little boring just to have, one voice doing the whole thing. And again, to prove the validity of the story and to prove the authenticity of the source, that's why you use a soundbite. I mean, you've got the actual voice, you've got the actual image. And if anything, it should reinforce the point of the story instead of being the story itself.
So I love that you're verifying, and I would probably say most people don't do that. They hear a soundbite and it goes into the category, does it agree with what I already think or does it disagree with what I already think? And a lot of people don't take it anywhere from there. A lot of people are getting their news from social media. And some social media, what is 144 characters or less? What advice do you have for people that use that as their forum to find out what the news is going on?
Well, social media can be a very handy lead source. Okay, I look at X, formerly Twitter, but most of what I look at are the social media dispatches, posts from what I would call the legit media outlets, like the Atlanta Journal-Constitution or the New York Times, Fox, CNN. You see both sides of the story there quite often. Social media itself can be a terrific first-person raw news source, but again, quite often things get amplified and pushed to the realm of, well, wait a minute, is that really the story here? What really happened? What happened before and after that social media post? Now, understandably, social media has played a big role in a couple of major moments in our recent history, particularly encounters that someone might try to deny. Some of the encounters with police that have made national news, both good and bad. But in the end, I just consider that part of the mix. And if I have to go back to it, if I had to give up something as far as being in the know about what's really going on, I think social media would be the first thing I would give up because to me, it has great entertainment value. But when it comes to making decisions about things where you need to really rely on what's truthful and accurate, it can come up lacking.
A good friend of mine used to work at a local paper here in Atlanta, and she would make the comment that there was a popular phrase that they would use on the floor, and it was, if it bleeds, it leads. And the meaning behind that was infotainment or shock value. But hey, if we get an exciting story here that people are really into and it does have blood and gore or whatever to it, it's going to sell papers. Are decisions really made like that on what runs and what doesn't run?
Well, again, you have to understand that you're putting together a program of some sort. And there has to be some, especially in TV news, there has to be some visual attraction to it. And yeah, let's face it, flashing red and blue lights, pillars of smoke and flame, arguments, conflict, weird things, the things that celebrities do are all news. In fact, I learned early on, Trace, that the five major news values are: is it local? In other words, the bank robbery across the street's a lot more newsworthy than the one on the other side of the country to you. Is it universal? Is it a story that affects everybody? Does it involve a celebrity? Does it involve conflict? Or does it involve oddity? If your story can fill one, or even better, one or more of those slots, it's usually a good one. But again, all these stories are going to compete with the space you have. And like I said, in radio, you only got 60 minutes in an hour. In TV, same thing. Newspapers, they could put more pages in there, but that winds up being a cost decision you have to make. And whether or not you run something further every day to get more news in. Let's face it, you got to have ads to make all that work. But generally speaking, if something hits those news values and it competes with the other stories, and there is a competition of which stories get on the air, especially in timed media like a broadcast, you defer to some of those values to say, okay, what is going to matter the most today?
I have to say, during COVID, the news was not helping my overall mood. And I was just not feeling good about the world. And I made the decision back then that I was just not going to watch news during that period. They weren't really telling us a lot of things that were helpful. And then I decided during that time I was going to read all of my news. I was going to find sources that I could verify and really dig in to what was going on. But as I was going through that process, the question that I had back then, and the question I'm going to ask you, is what responsibility does a network or does a journalist have to present what they're talking about in the news?
In other words, you would say responsibility to make sure that what you're doing is viable.
Well, maybe I can ask it this way. Is there a code when you have a job like you do?
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. And it begins with not making up the news. Hey, this would sound pretty cool if I do this, and even whether it's truthful or not. No, that's if you're calling it news, it has to be news. And there's lots of different codes of ethics out there, but if your listeners want to look up a pretty good one, it's pretty extensive. It comes from SPJ, the Society of Professional Journalists. It begins with seeking truth and reporting it. They also talk about minimizing harm, avoiding conflicts of interest, real or perceived, disclosing unavoidable conflicts. You need to balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort, like doing something that's a harmful story. Let's say you wind up putting someone in a bad light, or you putting someone at a scene out of context, for instance. Be accountable and transparent. Ethical journalism means taking responsibility for your work and explaining your decisions to the public. And you need to respond quickly to questions about accuracy, clarity, and fairness. That's kind of the cliff notes of the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. But that's a good one to take a look at.
So is that something that if you're going to go into the profession of journalism that you say, yes, I agree with this? Is this a voluntary standard? How is it enforced?
Generally speaking, it's enforced by the people you're working for, because one of the courses that you really need to take if you study journalism in a organized way is the laws behind it. And basically, that's how to keep your employer from being sued. Okay. And and that's not to say, hey, how can I get away with something? It's like, no, how can I make sure I'm legit is the bottom line. So yeah, your employer has to enforce that. And it's very rare that a journalist is working on their own, unless they're a one-man band, doing a podcast, or unless they're paid for their opinions. Okay. And then it's obvious that, okay, yeah, this guy, this gal has a point of view, and they're telling me what they think instead of maybe what they can prove right now. But you're always working with and for other people who are going to question, what you're doing. Okay, where did you get that? Hey, can you get me one more source? Do we really have to go with reliable, anonymous sources here? We need to be able to actually tell people where this is coming from, so they can make their own decisions about whether or not it's viable and whether or not it's true.
Scott, when it comes to influence over elections, how much influence does the media have?
Well, a great deal, because while people can certainly do their own homework, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit, if nothing else, media can present a perception of someone by what they include and what they leave out. And it's pretty important atmospherically. Now, I think you alluded to something just a moment ago. We got a long way to go until November 5th in the presidential election. And it's been a long time since we've had the candidates, the major candidates, locked in this early. Usually the presidential campaign begins in earnest around Labor Day because that's when people really start paying attention and buying in, realizing that the election's just a couple of months away, right? But we're going to have 5 months before we get there. And what's the media going to do with all this? So what I hope they don't do is to see how sensational it can be. And because they're running out of the everyday topics to talk about. Now, if something does rear its head, it winds up being, newsworthy enough to help people make future decisions about how they're going to vote. That's fine. But can I tell you something personal, how I feel about it?
Please.
Okay. Basically is, you know what? I'm just really going to turn down the volume between now and Labor Day personally. And some things are going to eke through. And you know what? The important stuff's going to last well beyond Labor Day anyway. So not to get too wound up at this point, other than take this time to do reasonable homework, read books. I mean, a lot of these candidates write their own books or write them with someone else. It's a good idea to flesh it out yourself instead of being exposed to the 24-hour news cycle over and over and over again.
Scott, you mentioned sensationalism, and to me, it seems like we've got more sensationalism in the news now more than ever. Is that an accurate statement? How have you seen the news change when it comes to covering items such as this over your career?
I don't think so. Scandal has always been newsworthy in one way or another. You've heard the term yellow press probably sometime in the past. And I can't call up in my head here where the term came from, but that basically is what you would call tabloid journalism that deals in scandalous behavior, lots of celebrities, that sort of thing. No, I don't think so. I think what is happening is we're more exposed to it, and by that I mean we've got more ways to be exposed to it. It used to be you just had one 30-minute newscast in the afternoon, and maybe you heard some news in your car on the radio. Well, now you got several 24/7 news channels competing for your attention, and you've got all the social media outlets as well. There's a million podcasts now that are out there. So there's all kinds of opportunities for people to jump up and down and try to get attention. And one of the ways they do that, as you alluded to just a moment ago, is to be sensational, especially, when you've got some of the more, what would you call them, traditional media outlets doing what they can to play it straight, but realizing that they need to keep their readers engaged too. And one of the nice side effects of that is more investigative journalism too, which is something that I'm a big fan of. Actually developing the resources and having a staff actually digging into the stories that might not get told, especially in the sensationalist atmosphere that you see in other parts of media. So I do appreciate that. But no, I think back to the original question, do we have more sensational media now? Well, we have a lot of sensational news, and we always have. And in this country, with the First Amendment being in play, it all can seep through.
So you brought up the First Amendment, and I've always had this idea in my head. I'm a huge fan of the movie Back to the Future. So I go back in time and I gather some of the founding fathers and we cram into the DeLorean. We come back to present day and I just ask them, hey, how did we do? When they start listening to the media, would they think we got it right with the First Amendment?
Oh, I don't know. That's a really good question. In some of the notes you and I passed back and forth, and I'll jump ahead to this. If there was somebody I could talk to throughout history, who would it be? And that goes right back to the First Amendment and Thomas Jefferson. And what I would ask him, and since you brought up the subject, Mr. Jefferson, walk me through what we've learned about the longevity of the U.S. Constitution and how you would change it now. What would you do differently? Well, Jefferson said something kind of prescient looking ahead to that back in the day. He said the earth always belongs to the living generation. Every constitution and every law naturally expires at the end of 19 years. That was what they considered to be a generation back at Jefferson's day. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right. So, yeah, I think that Jefferson had the right idea, obviously, with the First Amendment, because a lot of people do call it the fourth estate. It's the watchdog estate. It's not elected, though it is empowered by its audience. News outlets that don't have audiences tend to shrivel up and die. So, in a way, they're elected, but they're the watchdog over the other three, the judicial, the executive, and the legislative branches of government. So, yeah, I think the First Amendment is still viable, but that quote of Jefferson just fascinates me. Every 19 years, we ought to go back and retool it. I don't know, in the atmosphere that we have now of another constitutional convention, I don't know if that would be viable or not. What do you think?
I don't know. I've always been taught that the Constitution is the most sacred document that we have for our structure, the great experiment that was the United States of America. But it is interesting. I mean, maybe not 19 years anymore. Maybe now it's 35, 40 years where the generation passes to the next. But that really does put some things into context. I don't know. Maybe Doc Brown will someday invent that flux capacitor and we can go ask him ourselves.
I would love to. I'd love to get Jefferson beyond what we saw him do in the play Hamilton.
I love that play.
Yeah. What was the famous line? Jefferson came back from overseas. What was that? What did I miss?
That's right. That's right. Scott, what strategies do you think the media should employ to make sure they're covering fair and balanced coverage for all candidates, all parties, regardless of affiliation?
Well, that gets to be a process because in the recent Georgia presidential preference primary, the one on March 12th, there were 11 candidates on the Republican ballot and 3 on the Democratic ballot. And I'm pretty sure all but 2 had suspended or dropped out of their campaigns. And there was a vetting process that took place to get there. Most of it has to do with money, I think. And in campaign contributions, you got to keep the lights on. You got to be able to travel. So as far as covering all the candidates, I guess that's one of the good things about our primary system, where you start in smaller venues like Iowa and New Hampshire, and because everybody's still in, right? And their ideas can wind up being in better competition with each other. The first debates, remember how crowded the stages are in the first primary debates? Well, they got slowly but surely smaller and smaller and smaller in the number of participants there, mainly because the debate sponsors started applying some metrics like, okay, what's your level of acceptance? What's your level of contributions? What are the polls saying about your candidacy? And they came up with formulas and who could be included and excluded. Now, you could say that is a de facto ruling on both the candidates and their ideas themselves, that they weren't as viable as the others. And in the end, does the American public deserve to hear more from the candidates that might wind up mattering more in the end, rather than less, rather than a shouting match between 12 people? I guess you could go back, and I'm not a political theorist, and I'll probably get shot down for this, but I'll just say it. That was the original idea of our republic. The framers pretty much feared, I think, a pure democracy, because that can wind up being a mob rule. Instead, they went with a republic. We have a representative democracy. And that's one of the reasons it wound up being a filter. Well, the same kind of thing happens in the vetting process. Everybody starts with an even foot, on an even foot. But then it's kind of up to them, and it's up to the original voters in these primaries in which ideas take hold. Now, on the other side, okay, here's your balance. All right, you ready? I personally think we should have a national primary day. And all of these candidates have an equal shot on that day, rather than everything being strung out over several months. Decide who winds up being at the top of the pile. Again, these are party functions now. It's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and what other parties that might wind up being involved. I would still like to see a national primary day because I'm just one of these guys that says, well, do I really want everybody, the folks in Iowa, to decide who winds up making it? So there you are. There's a left, right, up, down, sideways, backwards, and forwards argument there on both sides.
I love that. And Scott, what was interesting here in Georgia was, as you mentioned, people had this whole host to choose from, but all of their campaigns, most of those candidates were all suspended.
True, but they suspended their own campaigns, but they still got votes. You can still vote for them.
Well, what does that mean when they drop out?
Well, you notice that most of them say they suspended their campaign instead of abandoning my campaign for no other reason than they can keep the door open, in case something else happens down the road. It's a little harder to go back. You can say you're suspending, and yeah, okay, so you're not traveling, you're not, you're not holding news conferences. You just don't have the campaign funds to do it, to pay the bills. I mean, it takes a huge staff to run these campaigns, and there's a huge payroll involved. But for the most part, when they say suspended, that means, well, okay, look, I'm considering myself not in the running now, but just in case, I'm still around. And you'll notice even in Georgia, let's see, and I don't have the number in front of me, Trace, but I think Mr. Trump got 495,000 primary votes. Nikki Haley got in the tens of thousands. I can't remember the number right offhand. And I think just about every candidate on that list got a few votes. And plus, there were also thousands of ballots that were not marked at all and turned in as a protest vote because some folks were dissatisfied with both candidates.
Scott, which key issues do you think the media should focus on during the upcoming election? And more importantly, how do they ensure that they're staying as unbiased as you do?
Well, that winds up being a really good decision that people need to make, voters need to make on an individual basis. And it's pretty easy to see what matters to most people with credible issue polling. The economy, inflation, immigration is rocketed to near the top. The folks with Pew Research in Tampa do a pretty good job with this. And they say the public's to-do list is really not that different from the past 2 years, although it differs greatly from 2021 when we were talking about the coronavirus ranking nearly as high as strengthening the economy. Would you like to hear the top 10 very quickly?
Please.
This is the Pew Research Center's annual policy priority survey. It was conducted in mid-January, 5,000 adults. That's a pretty good sample. Number 10, reducing the budget deficit. 54% call that a top priority. Now, you could pick more than one. Reducing availability of illegal drugs came in ninth. Eighth, dealing with immigration. I was surprised it was that low. Reducing crime, 58%. Making Social Security financially sound, 60%. Improving education, 60%. Reducing healthcare costs, 60%. Number 3, reducing the influence of money in politics. Wound up being at 62%. And again, the question was, what should be a top priority for the president and Congress to address this year? Number 2, 63% said defending against terrorism. And number 1, 73% said strengthening the economy. Now, I don't have all the figures and how they conducted the poll. Folks might have very well been giving this list of topics and they had to rank them. And this is why they came out the way they did. But again, in other polling I've heard that, inflation and immigration wind up being at the top. So I think it's pretty safe to say that it's still the economy. And one of the more news-centric things that are happening right now is immigration, the crisis at the border. So the idea is, okay, look, you decide what's important to you, then start researching the candidates and who matches up best with what you'd like to see done, or does the best job of addressing what is most important to you. And obviously, you can depend on the media for some of that, but probably need to start doing your own research. Google.news is a good place to start. And each candidate has pretty extensive policy positions on their websites, too. So you can at least go straight to the source and see who's saying what about what after you decide what's important to you.
Scott, we got to sample live just a second ago your process where you were reading through the list and you say, now, I don't exactly know if they were given a list to choose from or if this was on the top of everybody's head, but you can tell that that's part of your process. You're always thinking, hey, how did they get this document? What's the weight of this document? So you do a lot of fact checking. And I wanted to ask you, what is your process when you fact check for stories?
Pretty much it starts with, does this make sense? I mean, how far is this from what I know to already be true, or what I already know about this person, or what I already know about this process? And, from there, journalism is called attributed truth. In other words, who said it, and what did they say, and how does that add to what is actually factual or not. So you need to see a sentence, for instance, that says, okay, let's say police say that, some such and such happened. This person's accused of doing this and that. But you've sourced it that way. You've told people, oh, okay, well, the Atlanta police or the Gwinnett police or the GBI or the FBI is saying this, and that will be a privileged source. Obviously, a first person source as well. The candidate said this, or his or her opponent said this. If I see just a sketchy story that doesn't have any attribution in it, well, that tells me immediately that, all right, there's something wrong with this. I need to know where you got this. And just back to your point just a moment ago, I need to know how you did this survey, really, before I can have much more to say about it. But attributable truth is one of the standards. And also a standard of trust that you've established with a media outlet over the years. I mean, your favorite TV newscast are and the newscasters, and has this person let you down before? Have they been right most of the time in the past? The big outlets, again, back to that whole idea of fact checking each other, from editors on down, the Associated Presses of the world, the big national newspapers, the national media as well, even though some folks don't trust them. And that just goes back, Trace, to what I was saying earlier. Don't get your news from one place. I mean, make sure that you've got a variety of different outlets. And you know what? If you start getting, 2, 3, 4 of them saying the same thing, there's a pretty good chance it's right.
Scott, a few months ago, you interviewed me on the topic of PFAS, and that was a story that you ran on the morning news show. Can you tell us about the process that you went through? One, how you decided to run that episode, and then what were all the things you did to get it to air?
Well, let me see if I can just drag that story up in my memory right now. It started with a national story about how these forever chemicals are showing up in more places than ever before. And while I wasn't going to dispute that, needless to say, I did want to know more, especially from, right back again, a source that I trust, someone who knows I know what they're doing, someone who's been exposed to it in the industry. And that would be an expert. And I happen to know that you're in this business. You're in the water purification business, and that you also interact with your colleagues who are in the same business. And you've got a long background in it and the people you know. And when you told me that you couldn't remember the last water purification conference you went to when PFAS was not a big topic, well, that told me I was on the right track. So while I can't remember all the specifics of the story, that's how I got to, okay, I'm going to call Trace Blackmore because he's connected here and I know him and I trust him and he knows people he knows and trusts. And he'll have a good overview to say, okay, is this alarmist or is it the real deal? And I know what it was too. It was going back to the kind of effective filters that you'd be able to use at home. And that wound up being very valuable information for our listeners.
It was fun to be part of that process. And of course, that's got some sensationalism in it as well. Oh my gosh, I can't drink the water coming out of my faucet. I'm poisoning my family. So, but obviously, you did not report it that way. However, with that in mind, a couple of years ago, we had a local hotel in downtown Atlanta that got Legionella bacteria. And several people got sick, and newscasters found my name from our website, and I was interviewed on each one of the television stations that are local here. And all except one were focused on, do we tell people they can't come downtown or they're going to die instantly? I mean, there was a very sensational tone. It really off-put me from the media, but there was one gentleman that he just wanted to know the facts. He reminded me of how you just explained the story. And he was very forthcoming that he wanted to put the right information out there. So I love that you say, check your sources. And not that the other people were reporting wrongly, but I think they were leading with the wrong thing. Obviously, they took care of that. Nobody else died in Atlanta, and people were able to still continue throughout their day in the Atlanta area during that time. So anyway, that leads me to, is there an obligation that the newscaster, the journalist has to fact check to make sure that what they are presenting is true and fair?
On the other side of that is an absolute mortal sin to present a news story you know is not true. And maybe that's, I don't know, is that easier to prove? the one you know that is?
Well, Scott, do you then have, well, I don't necessarily know it's not true, so I'm not committing that sin?
Well, until I can reasonably prove that it is, it's not news. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's like we've been saying, constantly during this hour. Journalism is attributed truth. I mean, it's like, okay, I did not go out and personally determine that the water tower on that hotel in downtown Atlanta was going to be a hazard or not a hazard to people. So I got to depend on somebody who did. And I got to depend on someone in authority saying that it's not going to be a problem, or it is a problem, or an expert who can come through with that. So it winds up being, full circle in the end. Uh, Truth matters. That's the bottom line. And even though you might not be able to do it first person, as in, going down there and sampling the water yourself, right? You depend on people who you know are reliable sources, either by their position or their reputation, to prove that, okay, this is a viable story. And I can tell people it is what really is.
Scott, you've been in the industry for over 50 years. How many elections have you covered?
I guess technically everyone that I've been exposed to is a voter. It's what started in 1972. That was the first election I voted in. I was at the University of Georgia, and I went home to Griffin to vote in the presidential election between Richard Nixon and George McGovern. So in one way or another, since then, obviously more intensely in some years than others, I've had something, to do with the election process, whether it's just as an anchor on the air or as a reporter or holding a panel discussion or something like that. So yeah, that would make sense. In fact, we even had a award-winning radio show on a station in Griffin, Georgia, when I was in high school, and 5 or 6 of my buddies would grill a local politician each week, and the show was called Bridging the Gap. And it actually won an Associated Press statewide award for news interpretation in 1971.
How about that?
Yeah, that was, yeah, so I guess maybe it goes back that far. I don't know. But yeah, in one way or another, I guess, since 1972, I haven't counted them up. I really don't know. But I'm always fascinated by the process and still enamored of the fact that we Americans could go through it.
Well, Scott, you have been involved. You've been at ground zero on the newsroom floor during election nights. What happens during election night?
It's a frenzy. It's really something. First of all, you're keeping up with the count because in the end, that's what people really want to know. I mean, is my candidate winning? It's a frenzy. So not only are you keeping up with the vote count that's coming in, and again, you're relying on sources like in Georgia, the Secretary of State's office. And even those results are proclaimed unofficial until they're certified. The Associated Press is pretty much the gold standard for media when you get right down to reporting on the count. So you depend on them as well. Now, you bolster that with your reporters in the field, talking to voters, talking to each of the candidates. You have your panel maybe back on the station with your pundits, your analysts, who your listeners already know, who have had something to say about the process along the way, because you got to fill the time somehow between the numbers that are coming in. And then with any luck, before you run completely out of gas, you're able to say who won. Now, that usually is not up to individual outlets. That's up, again, to some of these national standards. The Associated Press generally gets the nod because they have a process they go through, and I'm not familiar with all the details, but it begins with not calling a race before the polls close. That's one of the big tenets that you have to pay attention to. So by the end of the night, again, it's a discussion. You may take calls from listeners too. You talk about the voting process itself. Were there any big problems that day? Was it smooth? Was anyone turned away? How big was the turnout? And just what people are thinking and feeling as they head into the hours after the polls close. So yeah, it's kind of a frenzy, but it really is one of the most fun nights of the year to be in the media business.
I'm imagining there's no sleep during that night.
No, there's very little. And then you have to get up the next morning if you're doing the morning show and talk about it all over again. So a lot of people are punchy.
Yeah, Nation, Scott's schedule for 30 years was you got up at what, 3 o'clock in the morning, went into the studio?
1:30 in the morning.
1:30. We
Oh,
went
yeah.
out to dinner, and I think it was 7:30, and you were saying, okay, it's getting close to my bedtime. We got to go.
Yeah, it's about 1:30 in the morning. And I don't recommend that because it's a violation of your circadian rhythms. But I gladly did it because I got to be on the cutting edge of a pretty decent product, I think. And that wasn't because of me; it was because of the people I worked with.
Well, I was on the recipient of that product. And like I said, I sure do miss having you as a part of my regular morning routine as I drive to work. Well, I mentioned going out to dinner, and you, of course, know my son, Hayden. He's turning 18, and this is going to be the first election that he is voting in. And not just him, but everybody in the Gen Z generation, they are super stressed out about making this decision. Do I vote for this person? Do I vote for that person? So much so, I just read an article where people are seeking counseling about it and they're on medications. So, my ask, as you have been covering so many of these, and you definitely do all your facts, not who should he vote for, but how can he take a deep breath, know that he's getting the right information so he can make the right decision for himself?
An allied area here is stage fright. You know what the best remedy for stage fright is? Preparation. And in this case, getting ready for an election, whether it's your first or your 40th, knowledge is power. Decide what's important. Have your son decide what's important to him. Then, like we said earlier, match the candidate who does the best job of meeting those criteria. Search the news gathering sites like news.google, local media, and even the candidates' websites. They usually include policy statements on specific issues. And then let your own homework be your guide. Talk to your friends about it too. I mean, obviously, the politics is not a subject that winds up being so nice sometimes, but at least get the feel from how your friends are feeling about making their decision. Maybe not the decision they're making, but how they're feeling in making the decision. And because we're a group, we're a democratic herd here, and sharing some of our own concerns with each other, whether it's in a formal setting like a group, or whether it's just one on one. The worst thing about any idea that's driving you to distraction is to ignore it. So knowledge is power. Decide what's important. Vote accordingly, and keep in mind that this is not a perfect world, and people are not perfect. You may not find the perfect candidate, but for you, you may find the best candidate by going through that process.
That sounds like great advice. And I want to underscore that we've gotten away from the ability to talk to each other, and we've got to agree with each other. Otherwise, we stop talking with each other. So it's my hope, and I think this interview is helping with this, that we can disagree with somebody agreeably, and then maybe we walk away with more information than we had about the topic in the end.
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing more boring than a one-sided argument.
Exactly.
That's the truth. So, yeah, absolutely. Encourage the ideas, but realize that sooner or later, you'll need to make your own decision, and just get to that point. Decide what it's going to take for you to get there.
Scott, there's no doubt why you are a member of the Georgia Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame and the Georgia Radio Hall of Fame. This has been great. I know we've helped so many people out there in the Scaling Up Nation. We've got members that listen to us outside of the United States, and I don't think you have to be in the United States to get a lot of help from this interview. So I want to thank you for that. But I did want to ask you, what's next for Scott Slade?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm mostly retired now. I still do some feature stories for the radio station. And as you said earlier, I fill in as the host of the morning show. But Trace, I'm not looking so much for any new media experiences, but I'd like to be more hands-on in the community. With this crazy schedule I was on for all these years, it was hard to do that. Well, one of the things that I've done to put that into action, I signed on as a poll worker. in my home county. We actually call them polling officials. I went through hours of training like all the others do. And here's what I came away with. Brand new respect for the people who do this and for the officials who work hard to make sure the election is fair and accurate. And this is not some Pollyannish statement. Everything they do for ballot security, the fact that no one person is ever left alone with the machines. They're sealed and resealed. There are records kept along the way, not only where those seals go at the beginning and the end of the day, but the voting counts, making sure all the machines are lining up with the right count. You don't actually count the number of ballots for each candidate, but you count the number of ballots cast totally. So you make sure that everything is coming up evenly so that when you turn in all the paperwork and the machines go back to the elections warehouse under lock and key, and then the actual ballots themselves are counted, you know you're getting something accurate. So it's a long way to say that I found this to be an incredible experience, and I want more like them because it gives me a better understanding of some of the stories that I've actually covered during the years from the outside looking in instead of the inside looking out. So you'll likely see me at the polls, maybe the primary in May and the general election again in November.
Scott, how many people, as you greeted them, recognized your voice?
A few. They said, "Are you the Scott Slade?" Because I was working at a polling location that is in my home county. And I didn't want to lie about it. I went, "Yeah, I am. I've always wanted to do this. I'm so glad you're here." I said, "Well, we're glad you're here too." That's kind of where we left it.
Nation, I can't tell you how many times Scott and I have gone out for a meal and the waiter has recognized his voice.
One of my favorite things about what I do is that my face is never on a billboard. It's always been voice recognition. If for any other reason that I don't want to violate anybody's expectations.
Scott, I ask lightning round questions to all of my guests. So are you ready for those?
Sure.
All right. My very first question, if you could go back to your very first day and visit your former self on your first day as a broadcaster, what advice would you give yourself?
Prepare more. Just make sure you're prepared before you walk in. There's been a couple of experiences that I had in my career that underscored that in a mighty way. And again, you learn, I think, a little more from your failures than your successes. So I'm grateful for those times when I discovered just how important preparation is.
Scott, what are the last few books that you've read?
Ooh, this is a good one. White Tigers. You might not know about this one. It's subtitled My Secret War in Korea. It's about a special forces war hero who passed away recently in Fayette County, who actually did service behind the lines in the Korean War. And it was co-written by Colonel Malcolm and Ron Martz, who was one of my contacts who served as a correspondent during the Gulf War. I just finished The Secret, Pure Pleasure, the latest Jack Reacher novel from Lee and Andrew Child. And I'm loving the book How to Tell a Story, the essential guide to memorable storytelling from the Moth podcast, MOTH. If you're not familiar, they specialize in verbal storytelling and actually have conventions and sessions all over the country. And if you'd like the Cliff Notes version of what it takes to tell a good story, it has to be true, told out loud, not read and recited, and always involves stakes and some sort of transformation.
Scott, when they make a movie about Scott Slade's life, who do you want playing yourself?
Oh, boy. I don't know. Like I said, my face isn't on billboards. So, the first name that comes to mind, and this is a big compliment to my respect for him, not to me, is Paul Giamatti.
Okay.
I'd love for Paul to tackle some of that.
I'm sure he would love that role.
I don't know. I really don't know. I just, I'm just one of those guys that hopefully the work has spoken for itself.
I can see it now. The first scene is you spinning records up in the barn.
Right, exactly. And the chickens clucking right under me.
Scott, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge into a world that we just don't get to see into a lot. So thank you so much for all your advice, all your comments, and we appreciate you being a guest.
Trace, I hope it was meaningful to your listeners and your viewers, and I appreciate the opportunity. All these opinions are my own. And, if nothing else, it just reinforces the importance of journalists getting it right. And I appreciate you for that.
Once again, Scaling Up Nation, that was Scott Slade. I cannot tell you how incredibly kind he has been to me. We got to meet scuba diving, and we did not only the academic work together, the pool work, but I also got to do his open water checkouts. We have not done a trip together. That is on the list. But he was so kind. He said, I really felt that you went out of your way to make sure that I had a safe experience and a great experience. If there's ever anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to ask. Well, right around that time, I had just started the podcast. I know I don't know what I don't know. And I knew who Scott was because I listened to him on my way into the office for the past 20 years. And I asked him, I said, I just started this podcast. Can you maybe help me with that? And let me know some things you know about broadcasting. And without missing a beat, he said, absolutely. When do you want to do it? And he came over to where I was recording and he looked at my equipment, showed me what I could do with my equipment. But then not too long after that, and I talked about this experience on the interview, we went to his studio and he was showing me what he had. Now, I don't have anywhere near the equipment he has in his studio, but I do have the same microphone. He jokingly calls it the Thriller microphone. It's the same microphone that Michael Jackson recorded Thriller off of, and it is the broadcaster's microphone. And so I did buy that microphone, and I also bought a new digital audio interface and, of course, some new programs to run on that on my computer. And he so upped my game. And then working with my audio engineer, Sean, making sure everything was dialed in properly. I can't remember the exact date that happened, but I did receive some feedback, people asking me, wow, what did you change? You sound so much better. So that was 100% started with Scott Slade, and then, of course, polished by the audio engineer of audio engineers, Sean Dooley. So that's how we get the great sound that we have. And I just want to thank Scott for helping me with that. Scott's also a pilot, and Scott has been giving me some flying lessons. So maybe someday I can tell you I have my pilot's license, and maybe I can fly over to where you are. We can do an interview together. Somebody I always want to interview in studio. We've never done it in studio before, and I've never had somebody on this podcast more than this individual. It's my friend, James McDonald, and I know he's your friend as well. And James McDonald is coming back this week like he does each and every week. Here is a brand new Drop by Drop with James.
Welcome to Drop by Drop with James, the podcast segment where we wonder, explore, think about, imagine, and learn industrial water treatment. You guessed it, drop by drop. Together. In today's episode, I have a challenge for you.
Challenge accepted.
The challenge is: calculate the softening capacity of your water softener based upon incoming water. Seriously, get pen and paper or even Excel and calculate it. Does your answer match the actual set point on the water softener? Why would you want to set the softener lower than the theoretical maximum softening capacity you just calculated? What can impact the functional softening capacity of a water softener? Is it possible for the incoming hard water quality to change over time? How could iron in the incoming water impact softening capacity? Water softeners are more complex than that enclosed vessel you see before you day after day. Learning the nuances of how it works and what can cause it to behave differently will make you a stronger water treater. I'm James McDonald, and I want to encourage you to be like water by forming bonds with those around you, dissolving new knowledge, and making worthy ripples, drop by drop.
Well, James, thank you for that. And Nation, happy 4th of July. Happy Independence Day. If you are not in the United States of America, you can celebrate along with us. And thank you all for listening. Regardless of what country you call home, we are all members of the Scaling Up Nation. I can't tell you how appreciative that I am of that. Thank you for listening. And Nation, if you know of an industrial water treater out there that does not listen to this podcast on a regular basis, let them know that we do have a podcast that's just for them, because the more we grow the Scaling Up Nation, the better this podcast becomes, because we get more people pouring into it. And as you know, the mission of this podcast is to raise the bar of the industrial water treatment industry. And of course, the larger the nation is, the bigger and heavier bar that we can all raise to higher proportions together. Nation, have a great week, and I'll have a brand new episode for you next Friday. Scale Up Nation, I believe there are so many potential certified water technologists out there that just have not sat for the examination. And I know that is a daunting thought, to sit for that examination. To help with that, I prepared a free CWT course where I outline the entire handbook of everything that you need to know to take and maintain your certified water technologist designation. To get that, go to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep. Yes, you heard me right. That is free.